Yeah, nice to see many of you who I've seen before and those who I don't know. Good to meet you as well, and thanks for joining. Um, yeah, so I have a very particular slant in terms of my own expertise and professional focus. I won't repeat the basic details of my bio and what have you, which would have been shared in the emails, and I will most certainly share a variety of links that support or offer an opportunity to reference or check out materials related to what I'll speak about today. But in general, my background comes from an organizational management perspective. I've been a management consultant now for more than 20 years, and I guess in terms of my interest in sustainability, climate change, and resolving complex systemic issues, I tend to come at it from an organizational standpoint, and my interest really is to think of how organizations need to evolve and adapt in response to what is changing, but also how they can be a force for good and the enablement of the transition of humanity to a different way of existing. So on that note, I will jump into my presentation. I've got some accompanying slides just to support, I guess, what could otherwise be a little dense and difficult to follow. I'll make this as brief as I can. I think I've got about 20 minutes. Is that right, Jatin?
Whatever works, 15, 20 minutes, anything along those lines. No firm, but just along those lines. Yeah.
Very good. So yeah, I will race through my slides and happy to come back to any specific details in our discussion. So off the top, I like to share this visual here. If you're not familiar with it, it comes from a model called the donut economics model, which is essentially similar to the SDGs, essentially suggests that we interpret the sustainability of the world based on thresholds. So based on the natural sciences, social sciences, and ethical frameworks, there are real, concrete, quantifiable measures of what is, by definition, sustainable or not sustainable at a global scale or at smaller scales. And so if we're really going to have a conversation about sustainability, it needs to be grounded in an understanding of thresholds, of science and ethics-based thresholds. And this donut essentially shows planetary boundaries along the outside, which you can see we have exceeded. And I believe that the latest donut shows even more excess. And then on the inner circle here is our social foundations, which essentially equate to the basic minimum requirements for meeting human well-being. And you can see by the red, the number of those globally that we aren't meeting as it stands. And so really sustainability by definition is about being inside of this donut, as in meeting those social foundations in concrete terms and not exceeding the planetary boundaries or the limits of ecological systems that all life depends on. So I'll shift focus right to my area, which is looking at things from an organizational perspective. And in particular, I want to focus on municipalities. My view is that local government is or may be the most critical leverage point for enabling global change. And I'll share a little bit about why that's my perspective. So firstly, municipalities, like most government, is mandated or responsible for supporting outcomes across the triple bottom line. They also collect resources from any number of different actors within the community or broader scale that they focus on, and with an interest in then serving the collective best interest of everyone, essentially. Municipal government in particular operates at a local scale, and from the perspective of managing complexity, we know we can't solve deeply complex systemic issues at a national or international scale. Solutions need to be reflective of local context, and so municipal government is at the right level for engaging in that complexity effectively. Municipal governments can also affect systemic change through their direct investment, by supporting others, and through policy levers. So there's a ton of influence they can have on a multitude of different actors simultaneously. Further, municipalities have a culture of sharing everything. Of course, their plans and such are public domain, but generally speaking in the sector, being copied is a marker of success. So unlike in the private sector where, competitive advantage and developing a unique or approach or intellectual property becomes a way of competing more effectively, in the municipal sector, it's very much about sharing and copying as well. And of course, in the municipal sector, there are dozens of NGOs that exist solely with the focus on enabling the sector to advance by identifying best practice and leveraging their own expertise and capacity to share best practice widely and very quickly. So all these factors make the municipal sector quite attractive. Sorry, just give me one. So the question then is, what is the challenge we face at an organizational level? And I would suggest that conventional management best practice is no longer fit for purpose. We see accelerating change, increasingly complex issues, the poly-crisis unfolding, and conventional management was never designed for this sort of circumstance. And we can look more closely at why. In the municipal sector in particular, there's a certain slant. I would apply this to all management practice, but some of these points are specific to the municipal sector, including the first, which is that the literature suggests essentially municipal governance and management practices have been informed by a paradigm of management called the new public management. And that's been over the last 4 decades or so, which is largely built around the extraction of private sector practices and the repurposing of them for the municipal sector, for government, without really any meaningful adjustment. And so this has created municipal organizations that are focused on efficiency and optimization of service delivery. Residents in communities are generally treated like customers, and the loudest voices, usually homeowners, are very much disproportionately represented in how decisions are made and investments as well. This has led to a very siloed organizational structure where issues and challenges are compartmentalized. And generally speaking, municipal managers or leaders are relatively risk averse. And there's very little room or openness in how they function to experimentation and failure, which is very much necessary in dealing with complexity. And ultimately, this leaves municipalities very much reactionary and responsive to whatever the most pressing needs are in the moment, rather than thinking about things over many time horizons. And so, the conclusion here is essentially we can't solve complex systemic issues on the periphery. On the left here, you have a model that's commonly referenced in systems theory called the iceberg model, which speaks to leverage. Essentially, the idea is the further down the iceberg you go, the more opportunity or leverage there is to make deep change, but also the harder it is to make that change. And so what I've done here is just replace the standard or generalized labels that go with each layer of the iceberg in the general model to reflect the context of an organization. So, at the top, usually what happens is we see organizations focused on, point projects and adopting actions that make incremental progress, or there may be a layer deeper, developing a sustainability plan or a climate plan, sort of lower level planning and policy development. And that's very much reflected in the approaches that we see commonly used, whether that be ESG, corporate social responsibility type approaches, where generally the management of sustainability issues is peripheral to the core strategic management function. It's an addition to, it's not integrated. And certainly that's not respectful of the complexity of the issues and the way that they actually exist in reality. So the key here is getting to the lower ends of the iceberg in terms of transforming strategic management practices. And ultimately that hinges on shifting the mindsets of leaders in the first place. And so we see the evidence of this. The approaches that municipalities and organizations in general are using have, as I'm sure many of you are aware, only led to incremental progress. I mean, over a couple of decades, we've barely, if at all, matched the impact of our growth, let alone made net new progress towards our climate and sustainability goals. So I won't focus much here, but I think the point of the story is where we've gotten is somewhat laughable, and it's not really at all in line or on a trajectory to give us some sense of confidence that we might avoid climate catastrophe or achieve sustainability within the time horizons that we know is necessary. So I want to point to some more evidence of this. My colleagues at an organization called Ecological that collaborated with a bunch of the organizations that you can see listed at the base of this report, engaged in a 2-year program that culminated in an online conference through the pandemic that was focused on looking at why is our progress on climate so slow? in the municipal sector and what's necessary, what kind of innovation is needed in order to move us ahead. And I think their engagement touched on something like 7,000 different actors across more than 100 countries. The results were pretty staggering. One, they identified what they described as the implementation gap, which is that we see evidence of more aggressive targets, more intense planning processes and engagement processes, but no greater progress. The progress remains largely incremental and not, again, in line with the goals and targets we know we need to meet. On page 6 of this report, again, I'll provide references. This is the visual that they provide. So through their 2 years of study, they came up with their own idea of what it would look like, or what the innovation that's needed would look like to move beyond incremental change. And what you can see here is that there's 2 key focuses. So changes in mindsets, that's visioning for the future, integrated systems approach, people-centered solutions, tools and processes is the other side. So participation, partnership, finance, capacity building, and research. So really about innovation at the deepest levels of the organization. And I mean, the exciting thing for myself and my colleagues is this very much mirrors our theory of change and the work that we've been doing for the past decade plus. So this brings me into a bit of a story about my own world as a practitioner and supporter of academics, let's say. And so what I want to talk about is the kinds of solutions that are necessary and that are available to begin stewarding this deeper transformation. So firstly, I think the challenge that's identified in the report and that most in the municipal sector would point to is the fact that there's an understanding that we need more systemic solutions, ones that are integral, that engage with the complexity of the issues we have in a manner that's reflective of just how pervasive and all-encompassing they are. The challenge is that while leaders get this conceptually or theoretically, they don't have the practical guidance they need to adjust their management functions in real terms. What do you do to lead accounting practices differently, or to plan strategically differently, to rethink budgeting or the way the organization is designed? And so I introduce you to sort of the focus of myself and my colleagues, which is on this emergent field that we've described at this point as systemic management innovations. And so a systemic management innovation is unique from a conventional management practice in that, one, it applies systems theory to recast how strategic management is understood. It provides detailed guidance on how to effectively adapt management practices. It respects science and ethics-based thresholds and how it's designed. And in some cases, it actually explicitly integrates those thresholds in the way the practice is executed. And it enables more integrative, collective, and adaptive practices. So I'll mention that this is a developing concept. We're in the process of publishing a paper with the Ecological World Secretariat on the topic of systemic management innovations and their role in supporting this transition of municipalities globally. And so to make that broad concept of systemic management innovations more concrete, I want to point to kind of a compare-contrast example. So we've spent the past, I guess, year or so working with the city of Nanaimo at West. And just for reference, the city of Nanaimo became the first Canadian city to adopt the donut economics model. And this is the one that I introduced a little earlier on. And for what it's worth, donut cities include places like Brussels, Amsterdam, Portland. So some of the more aggressive, ambitious, well-recognized cities in the world who are tackling sustainability issues in an inspiring way are the ones that were the first to adopt the donut. So Nanaimo really put itself on the map by doing this. They tried to apply the donut, which is essentially, if I may, a macro level framework. It points to what things look like at a global scale. They attempted to apply it themselves, and like every other donut city in the world, is at least that we've observed, essentially immediately failed to respect the most fundamental principle of the donut, which is thresholds. So the challenge comes in the complexity of making sense of global thresholds at an organizational scale. And so I want to provide an example that will kind of make that leap clear and why the complexity is so immense. So let's take an example of looking at water consumption in a city or for a community. So what you have here is, don't worry about the specifics, it's more for demonstrative purposes. You have, let's say, a community where consumption rates or levels of consumption are clearly going down considerably year over year. Looks great from a sustainability perspective. What does it actually tell us, though? On this slide here, which I appreciate is a little bit busy, I'll point your attention to the left side first. You see the same 3 bars of consumption going down, but what's added here are these sort of light blue bars, which represent the capacity of the system for producing water that exists. So in any local area, the capacity or the available water supply on a renewable basis is defined by the watershed, the local watershed. And that watershed, in most cases, has a very clear and established capacity that some authority is calculating that relates very much to the level of precipitation that falls in that area, minus some marginal calculations that says, we can consume this much water on an annual basis without depleting the stock itself and damaging the watershed. So we can consume sustainably over time by respecting essentially that limit. So on the left side, you have stable conditions, as in the precipitation doesn't change very much. And you can see that the reductions in water consumption are approaching the threshold. So still unsustainable in each case, but getting closer towards a sustainable level. On the right-hand side, what you see is a situation where there are drought conditions that are intensifying. You might liken this to California or South Africa, places that are affected by climate change. And while consumption is going down, sustainability is actually getting worse because the distance between the capacity of the watershed and our consumption is increasing. So this is to say, if we don't contextualize our consumption based on a real science-based threshold, we actually don't have a measure of sustainability. We have a measure of incremental progress that may tell us we're doing better or worse than a previous year or than a sector standard that's relatively arbitrary, but we're not in a conversation about sustainability. We're only in a conversation about sustainability if we apply our measure to a science or ethics-based threshold that is established. And so most organizations would have to work with multiple partners in order to get this sort of information. So here's the full compare contrast, just to make it crystal clear. Conventional sustainability measurement reporting would not consider a threshold. They would just measure what the consumption is and look to improve it year over year based on some arbitrary target. A systemic practice would establish a threshold based on an equitable fair share of the local watershed's renewable capacity. So if you can imagine, a watershed does not draw a boundary based on an arbitrary geographical city's boundary. There may be 5 municipal governments or municipalities that exist and rely on a single watershed. So there's a question between business, between residents, between any other function, how that capacity can be equitably leveraged. And so really we only have municipality-specific threshold defined by understanding the local threshold and establishing and equitably establishing what that municipality's fair share of that capacity would be. And from an engagement perspective, generally speaking, conventionally, no one's engaging others in the process of figuring out what that threshold is, or figuring out the threshold for that matter. But from a systemic perspective, the idea would be that all of the other stakeholders that have a dependency on that threshold are engaged in the process of establishing what the fair share should be and how they can agreeably come up with a method or an approach to distributing the capacity of that watershed. In terms of target setting, as I said, conventionally, it's just based on where we were last year and making an improvement or an industry standard or benchmark. In the case of a systemic practice, it's aligned with the threshold. And ultimately, performance, again, is defined as sustainability performance from a systemic perspective, as in how we're consuming against an equity-informed fair share of the threshold. Whereas on the other side, we just get an incremental measure that tells us, are we doing better or worse in relatively arbitrary terms? So I hope the example is helpful. Given where we are, I think I'm going to pause. I have another example that I'd be happy to share. I'll just close by saying, in case the conversation goes there, the work that we've been doing largely is around understanding from a strategic management perspective how we can engage with senior leaders to help them appreciate the necessity of transforming strategic management practices, the fact that we have tools that are fit for purpose, and essentially working hand in hand with them in order to transform those practices in a manner that is enabling and helps them to build new capabilities. Ultimately, I think the challenge that we see amongst leaders of any organization is that generally they're daunted by the degree to which complex issues are emerging and the fact that change is accelerating. So the conversation about sustainability may begin with senior leaders around something like managing for complexity, something that they feel they need to do and are struggling with, and eventually lead naturally by applying systemic practices to the organization becoming more sustainable organically, in that they begin to see themselves as part of a complex system, adopt practices that are compliant with that way of thinking, and ultimately the conversations about sustainability and organizational management come together in an integrated way rather than being separate and segmented. I'll pause there.